The Lord of the Rings, possibly the most important and famous work in the high fantasy genre, was written by the British author J.R.R. Tolkien. The first book, called The Fellowship of the Ring, was published in 1954, and the final book, Return of the King, came out in 1955. 70 years since Tolkien gave us this masterpiece, it has grown to be one of the most well-beloved and influential franchises in the world. With Christopher Tolkien publishing his father's works posthumously, along with The Hobbit, which actually came out in 1937, the world of Middle-earth has only continued to grow. With an extremely successful movie franchise that's garnered several prestigious awards, a TV adaptation was due. Amazon would be the one to win the lottery, as they would gain the rights to adapt The Lord of the Rings into a series. They would release the show titled Lord of the Rings: Rings of Power on September 1st, 2022 on their video streaming platform Amazon Prime Video. It would go on to be Amazon's most successful original series on the platform, garnering over 100 million views. This would be mostly a red herring, as the show would be met with a mixed reception by new and old fans of the franchise. Regardless, Amazon will be releasing the show's second season in August 2024. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. While the first season was more about world building and character introductions, things are guaranteed to pick up from the new season onwards. If the trailers are anything to go by, this new season is going to be a visual treat with spectacular settings and fight scenes. We will also get to finally see some of the key moments of the Second Age that defined the events of The Lord of the Rings in the Third Age, finally getting adapted to the screen. With the last season ending with the creation of the 3 Elven Rings and the new trailers focusing heavily on them as well, we believe that the show will finally begin living up to its title, The Rings of Power. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky, 7 for the Dwarf Lords in their halls of stone, 9 for the mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. This is the first part of the famous Rhyme of the Rings as told in The Lord of the Rings, and it speaks of the Rings of Power that were crafted in the early days of the Second Age of Middle-earth. They were forged in an age where the hearts of the elves didn't yet long for the West as much as they would in the later days, and the fires in their immortal hearts still yearned in the mastery of things. As Gandalf wisely puts it to Bilbo in The Fellowship of the Ring, there are many magic rings in this world, Bilbo Baggins, and none of them should be used lightly. These rings of power gave their users various abilities that granted them the power to siege greatness in their hands. Using the 9 rings, the men they were given to would rise up to tower amongst their kin, becoming great kings and sorcerers, more wealthy and powerful than in their wildest dreams. Their lifespans would increase, going far beyond that of any man, and they would, for a time, revel in their glory. However, they would not realize the corruption taking over them as their rings were bound to the One Ring of Sauron, whose malice lay heavy on the rings they wore. One by one, they would fall into the shadows and rise up as the 9 ring wraiths of Nazgul, neither living nor dead, their wills completely dominated by Sauron and the One Ring, literal shadows of their former selves. The 7 that went to the Dwarven Lords proved a bit more problematic for Sauron, for the dwarves, due to their stubborn and hardy nature, did not succumb to his will like the men. Instead, the rings were used to amplify their wealth and riches. Even if the ring-bearers did not meet the same fate as the Nazgul, Sauron's taint upon those 7 rings was undeniable. It made the dwarves grow more greedy, paranoid, and vengeful, and these would lead them to committing acts that would eventually, in the long run, be to their detriment and Sauron's benefit. 4 of the rings were consumed by dragons, and Sauron managed to recover only 3 from the ones he had given out. Unknown to Sauron, Celebrimbor would forge the 3 elven rings, and they would remain uncorrupted by his power. While these rings are powerful and hold fascinating lore in their own right, we're not here to discuss all of them. Today, we're here to talk about one of the 3 rings forged by Celebrimbor without the aid of Sauron, in secret from him. These were the rings given to the 3 elven lords, Círdan the shipwright, High King Gil-galad, and Galadriel, the Lady of Galathrim. These were Celebrimbor's greatest creations, and when Sauron learned of them, he flew into a rage and started deeply coveting the 3 rings. The ring that is meant to be discussed in our video is the one given to Galadriel. It is called by many names, such as the White Ring, the Ring of Adamant, and the Ring of Water, but its true name was Nenya. With the Lord of the Ring Rings of Power Season 2 finally out, Nenya, along with the other 3 rings, will probably have a vital role to play. With this video, we intend to gear you up and clear any doubts you have about the significance of this Elven Ring of Power. We'll be doing a deep dive regarding everything there is to know, from their creation to their impact on the lore and settings of the television series and the Lord of the Rings in general. The video will contain a large amount of lore from the source material to help you better understand where things are coming from. This is done not only to provide you with knowledge regarding the original lore of the Rings of Power, but also to provide you with some context, since the show is still fleshing out or has diverted from the original events of the books. So hop in as we explore what is perhaps one of the most beautiful and powerful objects created during the Second and Third Ages of Middle-earth, Nenya, the Ring of Water. Galadriel's origin. Where is she during the First and Second Age of Middle-earth? As it's no secret at this point, Galadriel is the one wielding Nenya, that Ring of Water in the upcoming TV show Rings of Power Season 2, just like she does in the original source material. We feel it's necessary to acquaint you with some history and background regarding her character. As the individual bearing one of the 3 Elven Rings of Power, Galadriel will undoubtedly have an even more important role this season than in the last. So please bear with us if you're already a lore master of the Lord of the Rings as we go through the brief history of her character, mostly for the benefit of the newer denizens of Middle-earth. Galadriel is considered to be the fairest elf in all of Middle-earth and in Valinor, and is perhaps the most ancient elf in existence in Middle-earth by the time of the events of the Lord of the Rings. She is of extremely high noble birth, being a granddaughter to both Finwë, the High King of Noldor Elves, and Olwë, the High King of the Teleri Elves. Her father is Finarfin, the 3rd youngest son of Finwë, and her mother is Arwen, the daughter of Olwë. In the source material, Galadriel joins the exodus of the Noldor after Morgoth steals the Silmarillion, following her brothers and Feanor to Middle-earth. Rings of Power, however, shows us that she is in Middle-earth primarily to avenge her brother, Finrod Felagund, who was killed by Sauron. While in Middle-earth, we didn't know much about her during her tale at First Age, other than the fact that she dwelt mostly within her maternal granduncle Thingol's court at Menegroth. This elven kingdom was surrounded, protected by a magical barrier called the Girdle of Melian. This is an important point, and something to bear in mind, and we'll see why later. It's here Galadriel is said to have met her future husband Celeborn, who was a kinsman of Thingol. She is also said to have visited her brothers, chiefly Finrod, who is the king of the underground elven kingdom of Nargothrond in West Beleriand, quite often. During the Second Age in the show, she is shown as serving under Gil-galad in Lindon and is a commander of his forces. She would refuse passage to Valinor and choose to remain in Middle-earth, though. With the passage of time, and thanks to the powers of Nenya, her heart would begin longing for the sea once again. In the books, she's the one responsible for establishing Eregion, along with her husband, which they ruled for a period of time. They would then move away and establish the realm of Lothlorien, where she would dwell for the remainder of her days in Middle-earth before sailing away to Valinor. Being able to see through the disguise of Sauron, who had taken the form of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and claimed to be a herald of the Valar, Galadriel rejects him. She even warns Celebrimbor to stop him from taking Anatar's aid, but her warning is ignored. Although her character differs vastly from the book, she's nonetheless extremely powerful, and we hope we can see her character display more wisdom worthy of the one called the Lady of Galathrim in this season. Celebrimbor would finish his greatest creation, the 3 Elven Rings of Power, which was created in secret, untouched by the Dark Lord. He would then give the Ring of Fire, Narya, to Círdan, the Ring of Air, Vilya, to Gil-galad, and the 3rd ring, the Ring of Water, Nenya, to Galadriel, upon learning of Sauron's treachery and the creation of the One Ring. He does so that they would hide it from Sauron, and in time, use them for the good of all by preserving their realms and healing the wounds of their peoples. The ring would stay with Galadriel until its power faded, and she took it with her when she sailed away to Valinor after the end of the Third Age. In the trailers, however, we're shown that unlike in the source material, she's actually wielding the ring. As the show is ongoing, we'll have to see where this leads her. We have our own theories that we'll discuss later in the video, so be sure to stick around to find out. The Origins of Nenya. Around the year 1200 of the Second Age, Sauron arrives at Eregion, taking the fair form of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and begins his great plan to corrupt the elves and bend the minds of all living creatures in Middle-earth to his will. He starts by earning the trust of the Gwaith-e-Myrdain, a brotherhood of the greatest elven smiths of the land, led by their gifted and ambitious leader, Celebrimbor. He manages to do so by granting them new knowledge to grow even greater at their craft. Sauron would begin teaching them about the forging of the Rings of Power, lying about the true reasons behind this eagerness to share his knowledge. Seeing that what their new well-wisher taught them was actually resulting in the improvement of their skills, the smiths, along with Celebrimbor, eagerly accepted him into their fold and began earnestly working under guidance. Celebrimbor, in particular, took to Sauron's instructions as he wished to create a legacy much greater than his grandfather Feanor's, who, although severely flawed, had crafted the greatest treasure in all of Valinor and Middle-earth, the Silmarillion, and was considered the greatest elven craftsman and smith to have ever existed. Being known as the second greatest elven smith to ever exist was simply not good enough for Celebrimbor. Sauron promised the smiths that their creation would not only allow them to preserve all that they hold dear, but would also provide them the necessary powers to be used for the betterment of their kind and Middle-earth at large. By the 1500 year of the Second Age, the Gwaith-e-Myrdain would complete the forging of the first 16 Rings of Power. Around this time, Sauron would leave Eregion to go to Mordor and begin the forging of the Master Ring, the One Ring to rule them all. Absent, the elves, under Celebrimbor, would forge the 3 Elven Rings. Having been created in his absence and without his help, Sauron would not have any direct influence on the rings, and they would be untainted by his malice. The 3 Rings of Power were named, as mentioned earlier, Narya, Vilya, and Nenya, with each corresponding to the elements of fire, air, and water. Narya was a ring made of gold and set with a ruby. Vilya, the most powerful ring, was also made out of gold with a sapphire in it, and Nenya, the chief amongst the 3 rings, was made of mithril and set with a stone of adamant. Around 1600 of the Second Age, Sauron finally completes the forging of the Master Ring and puts it on, immediately alerting the elven ring-bearers of his treachery, along with alerting Sauron of their existence. The elves quickly take them off and begin preparations to keep them hidden from the enemy. Celebrimbor decides to give the rings to the 3 greatest elves of the age in Middle-earth for safekeeping. To this end, he gives Nenya to Galadriel, who at this point resides in Lothlorien, and she counsels him to send the remaining 2 away from the enemy to Gil-galad in Lindon. There, Gil-galad keeps Vilya for himself and gives Narya to Círdan, the shipwright. This is how Nenya, the chief elven ring of power, would come into the possession of Galadriel, at least in the original source material. The Rings of Power series, however, makes a number of alterations to this story. To begin with, in the TV show, all the rings are made out of mithril, which is certainly not the case in the books. The major difference, however, lies in the forging order of the Rings of Power. The 3 elven rings are forged first in the show, which is very different from what we just spoke about earlier. There's also the fact that Sauron is still in Eregion when they are forged, which is quite contrary to the original story. From the looks of the trailer, Círdan, Galadriel, and Gil-galad are also in Lindon when they receive the rings, which is understandable as the show version of Galadriel is not the founder of Eregion, nor has she moved to Lothlorien at this point. The show does seem to have kept the wielders of the 3 rings in the correct order. In the show, Galadriel is shown wearing her ring along with the 2 other elves, and it will be interesting to find out how they use their ring. In the books, the rings are not worn by the 3 elves until Sauron is vanquished on the slopes of Mount Doom when his ring finger is severed by Isildur, using his father's blade, Narsil. They do not wield it because the reason they were given the rings was to safeguard and keep them hidden from the Dark Lord. If they were to wield these rings, that would defeat the entire purpose. One theory we have is that Galadriel tries to use her ring until she begins to feel Sauron's connection to it, making her stop using it by the end of the season. This would tie things up nicely to the original source material. We have a few more theories regarding her relationship with Nenya, which we will discuss more in length during the course of the video. There are a few other differences, but at this point, the show Rings of Power is its own self-contained entity. We felt it would help you develop a greater appreciation and understanding of the Elven Rings, especially Nenya, if we gave you a much more thorough background and history regarding its creation and how it comes into the possession of Galadriel, both in the source material and the show. Sauron's indirect influence upon the three elven rings. While it is true that the three elven rings were created without Sauron's knowledge, and were therefore spared from his malice and corruption, the Dark Lord still had a minor degree of influence on the rings. The three rings were still created using the technique taught to Celebrimbor and the Gwaith y Myrdain by Sauron, and therefore retained a connection to the One Ring. While Sauron could not use the rings of the elves to turn them into his servants, he is still able to ascertain things like who is wielding them and their location. This is shown when, upon wearing the One Ring, the elves are immediately alerted of the One Ring's creation and vice versa. As they take off the rings immediately and send them away for safekeeping, the last known location for the rings in Sauron's mind is Eregion. During the sacking of Eregion, it's said that even with the 9 and 7 rings in his hands, he wanted the 3 elven rings, for he deeply coveted them and desired them the most. He tries to torture Celebrimbor in order to get him to reveal their location, but the Master Smith doesn't yield, for which he is ultimately killed. Further proof of their connection is given when Círdan, Elrond, who receives the ring from Gil-galad, and Galadriel only begin using the ring after Sauron is vanquished by Isildur during the last alliance of elf and men. We're also told at the end of the Return of the King that with the destruction of the One Ring, the powers of the 3 elven rings of power would also lessen and eventually end. This would also result in all the things that their power had sustained fading away as well, turning them into mere relics. It goes to show that there was a much deeper connection between Sauron and the 3 rings, because the One Ring, which had much of his essence poured into it, was essential for them to sustain their powers. From what we've said earlier, it's also to be noted that none of the ring bearers, including Galadriel, dared to wear their rings when the One Ring was still in Sauron's possession in the books. We feel that Galadriel and others will soon begin to realize this sometime during the course of the 2nd season due to their usage of their rings. Just as how the previous season saw the creation of Mordor towards the end, this time the show might end with the creation of the One Ring and with Galadriel finally realizing its power over her own. We'll have to see what route Amazon Studios decides to go with this. What are the powers of Nenya? These rings are considered magical for a reason, as they come with their own set of powers that they bestow upon their bearers. One of the common powers that the Rings of Power grant their user is an increased lifespan. This is not a problem for the elves, however, as they're immortal unless they lose their will to live or are mortally wounded. Nenya, being the chief of the 3 elven rings, is considered to be very powerful, although not as powerful as Vilya. It grants Galadriel the power of concealment and preservation. Its powers of concealment extend to the ring itself, as it can make itself invisible to everyone else. Frodo mentions seeing the ring during his sojourn in Lothlorien to Aragorn, who admonishes him for talking about it in the open. After Sauron loses possession of the One Ring, Galadriel is seen using Nenya's powers of preservation to stop Lorien's decay due to the passage of time. She's able to increase the splendor and beauty of Lothlorien, turning it into a realm resembling those that exist in Valinor. Thanks to Nenya's powers, Lothlorien was the only realm outside of Valinor where the Malorn trees flourished. Through the power of Nenya, she preserved the beauty and splendor of the realm for much of the 2nd and 3rd ages, until the destruction of the One Ring caused its powers to slowly fade away as well. Using her ring's 2nd power of concealment, she managed to protect Lothlorien from outsiders and servants of the Dark Lord. None could find their way through the woods of Lorien, as confusion and madness would descend upon them, making them lose their way only to be killed by the elves protecting the borders. This enchantment was very similar to the one put up by her guardian and friend Melian the Maya, known as the Girdle of Melian, around Doriath, her granduncle's kingdom, during the First Age. During the Third Age, Lothlorien would be under constant attack from Moria and Gundabad's orcs during the War of the Ring, and Nenya's powers would protect Lothlorien through that turbulent period. The enchantment was so strong that it was believed that even if all the orcs in Middle-earth descended upon Lorien, the forest wouldn't be breached unless Sauron himself were to come. Besides these 2 powers, the ring is said to have greatly enhanced the natural and mystical attributes of its bearer, enhancing their gifts further. Also being the Ring of Water, it's believed to be the cause for the increase in Galadriel's longing for the sea and her home across it in the later days. What role will Nenya play in the Ring of Power? During the course of the series, we believe Galadriel will use the concealment powers of her rings to aid both her allies and herself during combat and tricky situations they find themselves in. The power of preservation might also be interpreted to mean the preservation of life, granting her healing powers, and we might see her making use of this to provide succor to her friends. Even if the ring is used as a plot device to cast Sauron's shadow upon Galadriel in the show, it remains ultimately free from his corruption. We believe that, unlike in the book, where she removes the ring, she will overcome its weakness and use it as a weapon against Sauron. Nenya will most likely serve as the antithesis to Sauron's One Ring in the show. This is our alternate theory to the one where we suggest upon realizing Sauron's influence on her own ring, she takes it off. The showrunners might even try to show what Galadriel would be like if she were to give into the powers of the One Ring, just like she would show Frodo later in the Third Age, but in this case, through Sauron's influence over Nenya. We might even begin to see the beginnings of Galadriel longing for the sea and Valinor caused by the ring's powers. It could certainly be used as a tool to steer her character away from the vengeful, reckless individual she is shown as in Season 2 towards a much wiser and more measured character. This would certainly be solid character development for Galadriel, and fans would be treated to the Galadriel they are more familiar with from the books and the movies. The Ring of Water could be used as a medium to highlight the transition of her character from a raging sea to a tranquil ocean during the course of the show. It's certain that the Nenya will have a much more far-reaching effect on Galadriel's character and journey during the course of the show, other than simply giving her a few new magical abilities. Marvelous verdict. The creations of the Elven Rings of Power have so many layers to them. By creating the 3 rings for the elves, Celebrimbor redeemed himself not just in front of his kin, but in front of himself. These 3 creations, especially Vilya and Nenya, would go on to heal and provide succor in a world that was devastated due to his first 16 rings. The elements of the rings, fire, water, and air, correspond to the fate of his grandfather's Silmarillion, which were equally, if not more important items than the rings during the First Age. The first Silmaril is thrown into the ocean by Maglor, the second is cast into a fiery chasm alongside Medras, and the third and final one is taken into the sky by Earendil and turned into a star by the Valar. It's also to be noted that the reason Sauron is able to teach the elves much about smithwork and jewel crafting is because he himself was formerly a Maya of the smith god Aule and was known by the name Myron. It is only much later that he would be seduced by Melkor and would change his allegiance. This goes to the point that despite the passing of eons, he still had not lost his skill of hand and the knowledge and wisdom of his past. Unlike the 2 other rings that would change owners over the course of their history, with Círdan giving the ring to Gandalf and Gil-galad giving his to Elrond, Nenya would remain in the hands of Galadriel right to the very end. At the end of The Lord of the Rings, when it begins losing its power, it's carried over to Valinor by Galadriel. There, in the Undying Lands, Celebrimbor's work would endure the test of time until the breaking of the world. With the passing of the Elven Rings to the Undying Lands, all that they preserved with their powers, including Rivendell and Lothlorien, would eventually succumb to the decay of time. Their passage would also mark the end of the Third Age and the beginning of the Fourth Age of Middle-earth. The events depicted in the show are what, for the most part, affect the events that we witness in the Lord of the Rings books and movies. We're waiting with bated breath to see what spin Amazon puts on these. If the trailers are anything to go by, the Elven Rings, especially Nenya, will be front and center in the plot and will play a major role in the upcoming season. We hope this show succeeds so that we can keep getting Middle-earth content in the future, as too much is never enough. For now, we've come to the end of this video, and we hope that it's been able to prepare you or answer some of the questions you might have had regarding Nenya, the ring that Galadriel is shown wielding in the trailers. Be sure to follow us for more Lord of the Rings content, and we'll see you in Middle-earth in August. Stay safe and stay marvelous. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.